The blizzard outside was merciless, howling through the mountains like a beast hunting its prey. Jack Carter sat alone in his remote cabin, the flickering glow of the fireplace casting long shadows across the wooden walls. A retired firefighter, he had come here for peace, seeking solitude after years of chaos. But on this fateful night, he was about to encounter something, or rather, someone that would change his life forever. A desperate scratching at the door shattered the eerie silence. Jack stiffened, his grip tightening on the coffee mug in his hand. Who could possibly be outside in this storm? When the sound came again, accompanied by a muffled whimper, he knew he couldn't ignore it. What he found when he opened that door was the last thing he expected: a trembling German shepherd, her fur matted with ice, and beneath her, two tiny puppies barely clinging to life. But this was just the beginning. Part 1. Jack's Solitude and the Storm. Jack had always been a man of routine. Wake up, chop wood, make coffee, and spend his days lost in the simplicity of nature. The quiet of the forest, the predictability of his chores, and the absence of human interaction had become his comfort. After years of firefighting, where every day had been unpredictable, Jack had sought out the simplicity of isolation. But sometimes, life had a way of throwing the unexpected at you when you least expected it. That night, the storm was unlike anything he had seen in a long time. The wind roared like a hungry beast, slamming against the walls of his cabin with a force that made the wooden beams creak in protest. Snow piled against the windows, nearly obscuring the outside world. Jack had settled into his recliner by the fireplace, a book in one hand, a steaming cup of coffee in the other. The storm was brutal, but he had seen worse. Then came the sound. At first, he thought it was just the wind, a branch scratching against the cabin. But then it came again, scraping, desperate, unmistakable. Jack's brow furrowed. He set down his coffee and stood, listening intently. When the whimper followed, faint but heart-wrenching, he knew this was no tree branch. Jack grabbed the rifle he kept near the door. Years of habit made it instinctive. Cautiously, he unlatched the heavy wooden door and pulled it open just enough to peer outside. The cold wind instantly cut through him like a blade, snowflakes swirling violently as they rushed inside. But what he saw made him forget the cold altogether. A German shepherd, her body trembling, her coat clumped with ice, stood just beyond the threshold. Her ears were pinned back, her tail tucked low, but what struck Jack the most were her eyes wide, desperate, pleading. Beneath her, two small puppies huddled close, barely visible against the thick blanket of snow. For a moment, Jack simply stared. He had encountered a lot in his life: burning buildings, life or death situations, but this was different. This was something raw, something personal. The mother dog stared at him, her body shaking not just from the cold, but from exhaustion, from fear. Jack hesitated. Letting them in meant responsibility. It meant opening himself up to something more than his own thoughts. But how could he shut the door on them? If he left them out there, they wouldn't survive the night. He knew that. Their eyes met again, and in that silent exchange, something shifted in Jack. He pulled the door open wider. "Come on, girl," he said, his voice softer than he had intended. "You'll freeze to death out there." She hesitated, her instincts screaming caution. But she also knew she had no other choice. Slowly, she nudged one of the puppies forward with her nose, then the other, before stepping inside herself. The moment she crossed the threshold, her legs nearly gave out beneath her. Jack shut the door behind them, sealing out the howling storm, but he knew this was just the beginning. Whatever had brought them to his doorstep had been more than just the weather. And something told him their story was far from over. Part 2. Building Trust. The cabin was warm, but the German shepherd continued to tremble violently. Jack quickly grabbed an old blanket from the couch and gently draped it over her. She flinched, but didn't bolt. Her instincts told her to be wary, but exhaustion had robbed her of the energy to resist. The puppies clung to her, tiny bodies barely stirring, their fragile whimpers almost drowned out by the wind rattling the windows. Jack crouched down slowly, trying to make himself seem less intimidating. "It's okay, girl," he murmured. "You're safe now." The German shepherd lifted her head slightly, watching him with those wary golden-brown eyes. She didn't trust him, not yet. Jack had seen that look before, in the eyes of people he had rescued from burning buildings, from car crashes, survivors, people who had been hurt, abandoned, left to fend for themselves. He reached for a bowl, filled it with warm water from the kettle, and set it on the floor beside her. "Drink up," he encouraged. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, cautiously, she leaned forward and lapped at the water, her tongue moving slow, deliberate. Jack exhaled, a tension he hadn't realized he was holding, leaving his shoulders. He turned his attention to the puppies. They were small, too small. Their fur was damp, their bodies too thin. He had no experience with newborn pups, but he knew enough to see they were weak. He needed to keep them warm. Jack grabbed another blanket, folded it carefully, and placed it near the fireplace, before gently lifting the pups and setting them down on it. The mother immediately tensed, a low growl vibrating in her throat. Jack backed away, hands raised in surrender. "Easy, girl. Just trying to help." She watched him for a moment before crawling forward and curling her body protectively around them. Jack ran a hand over his face. He had planned on spending the storm alone, drinking his coffee, maybe finishing his book. Now he had 3 lives depending on him, and he had no idea what to do next. The night passes, hours passed. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the fire burned steadily, casting a golden glow over the wooden floors. Jack kept his distance, letting the mother dog settle, letting her realize he wasn't a threat. At some point, she shifted slightly, nudging one of the pups closer to her belly. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but Jack took it as a good sign. She was warming up to him just a little. Jack sat back in his chair, watching the fire flicker. The soft sounds of the mother licking her pups filled the room. He had spent so long in solitude, the silence his only companion. Now, that silence was broken, not just by the fire, but by the quiet, unspoken understanding between him and this dog who had appeared at his door. As he watched them, a thought occurred to him. "Guess I should call you something, huh?" The dog didn't respond, of course, but Jack studied her carefully. She was strong, despite the condition she was in. Protective, resilient. "Grace," he said aloud. "Yeah, you look like a Grace." She didn't react, but Jack smiled anyway. Tomorrow, he would figure out what to do next. Tonight, they would all just survive. Part 3, The Shadow in the Woods. As the storm finally began to subside, the silence outside became eerily noticeable. Jack had been so focused on Grace and her pups that he hadn't paid attention to anything else. But something gnawed at him, a sense of being watched. Late in the night, as Jack stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape, he saw movement near the tree line. A figure tall, shadowy, barely visible in the moonlight. Jack's stomach clenched. His years as a firefighter had trained him to recognize danger, and every instinct in his body told him that this was not just his imagination. Someone was out there. Grace, still curled around her pups, suddenly let out a low growl, her ears perked, eyes locked on the same spot where Jack had seen movement. Jack grabbed his rifle and moved toward the door, his pulse quickening. Whoever was out there had been standing too still for too long. He reached for the doorknob, but hesitated. Confronting the unknown in the dead of night, in the middle of a snowstorm, was reckless. Instead, he pulled the curtain closed and turned back toward the fire. Grace's growling ceased, but she remained tense, her body coiled as if ready to spring. Jack sighed and sat back in his chair, but sleep wouldn't come easy that night. The storm had brought more than just snow. It had brought something or someone else. And Jack had a feeling that whatever had found its way to his cabin that night wasn't done yet, and he was right. Part 4. Confrontation in the night. Jack awoke with a start, heart pounding. The cabin was silent except for the steady crackling of the fire, but something had pulled him from his sleep. A noise, a disturbance. He strained his ears, barely breathing. Then he heard it movement outside. A soft crunch of snow, faint but deliberate. Jack slowly reached for his rifle, his mind racing. He glanced at Grace, who was already awake, her ears perked, her body tense. She was staring at the door, a low growl vibrating in her throat. Someone was out there. Jack moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. His breath fogged up the glass as he peered outside. At first, he saw nothing but the still darkness. Then movement near the tree line, a shadow shifting between the trees, watching. A cold dread settled over Jack. This wasn't some lost traveler seeking shelter. Whoever it was had been standing there for a while, silently observing. He gripped his rifle tighter and exhaled slowly. If they wanted trouble, they were about to find it. Part 5. The truth unfolds. Jack barely slept that night. Every creak of the old wooden cabin, every gust of wind outside, sent his nerves into high alert. Grace, still curled around her pups, remained restless as well. Occasionally, she would lift her head, ears twitching, nose sniffing the air as though expecting danger to walk through the door at any moment. Jack understood her unease. Something or someone was out there. Morning arrived with a deceptive calmness. The sky was clear, the storm had finally passed, and the landscape outside was blanketed in pristine white. But that didn't mean the danger had left with it. Jack stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, scanning the perimeter. The snow had settled, making it easier to see fresh tracks. And there they were, deep imprints leading from the tree line, stopping just short of his cabin. He crouched down, examining them more closely. The prints were too large for an animal, too precise for someone just wandering lost. Whoever had been watching last night had been deliberate in their approach and deliberate in stopping just before reaching the cabin. A chill ran down Jack's spine. He wasn't dealing with coincidence. This was planned. As he arose, a new detail caught his eye, something half buried in the snow near the edge of his porch. A small piece of fabric, dark and tattered. He bent down, pulling it free. It was part of a worn-out jacket, torn at the seams. Something about it felt familiar. He turned it over in his hands, and then he saw a faded patch stitched into the material, barely legible from where. It was a logo, the kind used by businesses for branding. Jack's heart kicked into a higher gear. He had seen that logo before. He turned and hurried back inside, slamming the door behind him. Grace immediately sat up, alert to his tension. Jack placed the fabric on the table and stared at it, his mind racing. He racked his memory, trying to place it. And then, like a slow-moving revelation, it came back to him. Years ago, before his retirement, before the cabin, he had responded to a fire on the outskirts of a small town not far from here. It had been an illegal dog breeding operation, one of the worst cases of animal neglect he had ever seen. The fire had started in the back, spreading rapidly through the wooden structures. By the time Jack and his crew arrived, the place was nearly lost. But that wasn't the part that stuck with him. It was what, or rather, who they had found in the wreckage. The owner, a man named Vincent Holloway, had been running the operation for years. Malnourished dogs, filthy conditions, countless animals bred purely for profit, with no regard for their well-being. The fire had destroyed the facility, but Holloway had escaped legal consequences due to lack of direct evidence, tying him to the worst of it. He had walked free. Jack clenched his fists. The fabric in front of him bore the same logo that had been on Holloway's work jackets. Could it be him? His gut told him it was no coincidence that a half-starved German shepherd had shown up at his door with puppies in the middle of a blizzard, only for a shadowy figure to appear shortly after. If Holloway was back in the area, that meant trouble. And worse, it meant Grace's past was more harrowing than Jack had imagined. Jack exhaled slowly, his mind settling into a familiar rhythm. He had spent his life solving problems, responding to crises. This was no different. First, he needed more information. Second, he needed a plan. He glanced at Grace, who was now sitting beside the table, watching him carefully. "You know him, don't you?" he murmured. Grace didn't respond, of course. But the way she lowered her head slightly, the way her ears flicked at the sound of his voice, it was as if she understood more than she let on. Jack reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Sheriff Miller picked up on the third ring. Jack, been a long time. Yeah, Jack said, cutting straight to the point. I think we have a problem. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Jack knew that if Holloway was back, he wouldn't just disappear. He was the type to tie up loose ends. And Grace, her pups, and Jack were now part of whatever unfinished business he had. By midday, Sheriff Miller had arrived at the cabin. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of authority that few dared to challenge. She listened as Jack explained everything: Grace, the shadow in the woods, the fabric from Holloway's old operation. Miller sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. Damn it. We always knew he might come back. He never fully left the business, Jack. Just got smarter about covering his tracks. Jack felt his jaw tighten. So what now? Miller leaned against the counter, thinking, we need to be careful. If Holloway is here, it means he's looking for something. Or someone. Her gaze drifted to Grace. Jack followed her eyes and knew they were thinking the same thing. Grace wasn't just some random stray. She had escaped something, and now, that something was coming back for her. Jack squared his shoulders. I won't let him take her, or those pups. Miller nodded. I know, and that's why we're going to stop him before he tries. Outside, the clear blue sky masked the tension settling over the cabin. The blizzard was gone, but the real storm was just beginning. Part 6. The Hunter and the Hunted. Jack stood by the window, his pulse steady but his mind racing. Sheriff Miller's visit had confirmed what he already knew deep down: this wasn't over. If Vincent Holloway was back, he wasn't going to stop at lurking in the woods. He was here for something specific. Or someone. Grace. Jack glanced over at her, still curled protectively around her pups. Her body was tense, her ears flicking toward every sound outside. She could sense it too. The threat wasn't gone. It was waiting. Jack walked over to the kitchen counter and reached for his old radio scanner. The static crackled to life as he adjusted the dial, trying to pick up any local transmissions. Miller had promised to keep a close watch on the area. But Jack had learned a long time ago that trusting only the law wasn't always enough. This is Deputy Collins. A voice finally came through, faint but clear. Patrolling East Perimeter near Carter's cabin. No signs of movement so far, but tracks indicate someone was nearby recently. Over. Jack exhaled through his nose. So they knew. Good. But knowing was only half the battle. He grabbed his rifle from the corner, checking the chamber. He had hoped his days of needing it were long behind him, but life had a way of pulling a man back into the fight, whether he wanted it or not. The trap is set. Jack wasn't the type to wait around for trouble to come knocking. He knew the woods, knew how to track, how to move unseen when needed. If Holloway was out there, he was going to find him first. As night fell, Jack layered up, strapping his rifle over his shoulder. He crouched by the fireplace, stroking Grace's head. I'll be back, he murmured. Keep the pups close. She looked up at him, her amber eyes full of understanding. She didn't whimper, didn't try to follow him. She knew. Jack stepped out into the night, the cold biting against his skin. The forest was eerily quiet, the fresh snow absorbing sound, making every footstep feel heavier. He moved slowly, following the tracks that led away from his cabin. They wound deeper into the woods, toward an old hunting shack that had been abandoned for years. His instincts screamed at him. This was a trap. But if Holloway thought he was the only hunter out here tonight, he was in for a surprise. The face-off Jack reached the shack, pressing his back against the outer wall. The door was slightly ajar, the interior cloaked in darkness. He could hear faint rustling inside. Someone was there. He stepped forward, rifle raised. I know you're in there. Might as well come out now. Silence. Then a creak. Jack tensed, his finger hovering over the trigger. Didn't think you'd remember me, Carter. The voice was low, rough, familiar in a way that made Jack's stomach twist with anger. Holloway. Jack didn't lower his weapon. Oh, I remember you just fine. Didn't expect to see you crawling back after all these years. A chuckle from the darkness. You got in my way once. Thought I'd return the favor. Jack's grip tightened. That dog isn't yours. She never was. Whatever you did to her before, it's over. She's not going back to you. A slow sigh. See, that's where you're wrong. That dog is valuable. She was trained for protection, bred to be strong. And I put years into making sure she could survive anything. You think she ran to you by accident? She remembers me, Carter. Jack's blood boiled. She remembers all right. That's why she's terrified of you. A pause. Then, suddenly, movement. Jack barely had time to react before Holloway lunged from the darkness, a blade flashing in the dim moonlight. Jack sidestepped just in time, bringing the butt of his rifle up hard against Holloway's ribs. The impact sent the man stumbling back, but he recovered quickly, eyes wild with fury. You don't know what you're doing, Holloway growled, circling Jack. She's dangerous. She's a fighter. You think she's yours? The second she gets the chance, she'll turn on you. Jack steadied his aim. Only thing she's turning her back on is you. For a moment, Holloway just stood there, breathing heavily, calculating. Then, a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. We'll see about that. Then, just as quickly as he had attacked, Holloway bolted into the trees, disappearing into the night. Jack took a deep breath, lowering his rifle slightly, but not letting his guard down. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A line in the snow. By the time Jack returned to the cabin, dawn was beginning to break. Grace was waiting at the door, her body tense, ears flicking forward as he approached. Jack knelt beside her, running a hand through her fur. He's out there, and he's not done. She let out a low rumbling growl, her body pressing closer to his. Jack exhaled, glancing toward the tree line. Holloway wanted a fight. Fine. He'd just made a mistake picking this one. Part 7. Holloway strikes back. Jack knew Holloway wouldn't stay hidden for long. Men like him didn't slink away into the night, unless they had another move to play. And that's what made this even more dangerous. Holloway wasn't just a threat, he was a man who had something to prove, a man who believed he had been wronged. By morning, Jack had already started fortifying the cabin. He reinforced the doors, double-checked the locks on the windows, and even rigged up a few tripwires around the perimeter using some old fishing lines and cans. It wasn't much, but it would give him an early warning if Holloway tried sneaking up again. Grace was restless. She stayed near Jack, pacing the cabin in sharp, alert movements. Occasionally, she'd sniff at the door or let out a low growl toward the window, as if she could sense something Jack couldn't. Her pups, oblivious to the tension, huddled in a warm bundle near the fireplace, sleeping soundly. Jack stroked Grace's head. We'll get through this, girl, I promise. She leaned into his touch for just a second before snapping her head back toward the door. Her ears pricked up. Jack stiffened, listening. A noise. It was distant but unmistakable. A crunching of snow underfoot. Someone was out there. Jack moved to the window, his breath fogging the cold glass as he peered out. The early morning light stretched across the vast snowy landscape, and then movement. A dark figure at the edge of the woods, watching. Holloway. Jack's hands clenched into fists. This time, Holloway wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was making himself known. This wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. A declaration of war. The siege begins. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the front door, cracking it open just enough to call out, "You're wasting your time, Holloway. You're not getting her back." Holloway chuckled, his voice carrying easily across the stillness of the snow-covered landscape. "You don't get it, do you, Carter? This isn't about just her. You think you saved her. You think she's yours now. She was trained to follow orders. And you, my friend, are standing between her and the man who used to give them." Jack kept his rifle raised, his stance firm. "You're a sick bastard. She's not some tool you can use. She's free, and she's never going back to you." Holloway took a slow step forward. "We'll see about that." Then, without another word, he disappeared back into the trees. Jack knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. By nightfall, Jack had repositioned some furniture, to create makeshift barricades near the windows. The cabin was old but sturdy, and he knew every creak in the floorboards, every weak spot that could be exploited. He wouldn't let Holloway take them by surprise again. And then, just as he was finishing his preparations, Grace let out a sharp bark. Jack spun, heart pounding. The first tripwire had been triggered. The attack, the sound of shattering glass exploded through the cabin as the side window was breached. Jack ducked instinctively as someone lunged inside. Holloway wasn't alone. He had brought help. Jack raised his rifle, but before he could fire, a second man crashed through the door, tackling him to the ground. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs as they struggled against the floorboards. Jack swung his elbow, catching the attacker in the ribs, but the man was storm-trained. Holloway's voice cut through the chaos. "Get the dog." Grace sprang into action, her snarl filling the cabin as she lunged at the intruder near the door. Her jaws clamped down on his forearm, and he howled in pain, staggering backward. Jack took the opportunity, shoving his own attacker off him and scrambling to his feet. The cabin erupted into violence. Jack barely had time to register what was happening before Holloway himself was inside, moving fast, too fast. The knife in his hand glinted in the dim firelight as he swung for Jack. Jack ducked, twisting to avoid the blade, but it still sliced through the fabric of his jacket, grazing his skin. He didn't have time to bleed. Not now. Jack swung back, his fist connecting with Holloway's jaw. The other man staggered but recovered quickly, his grin twisted with something cruel. "You always were a fighter, Carter. Too bad you don't know when to quit." Jack didn't respond, he just kept fighting. The turning point. The second man, the one Grace had bitten, was now fumbling to grab her, his hands reaching for her collar. But Grace wasn't going to be taken again. She dodged, snapping at his legs, forcing him to stumble back. Jack saw his opening. He lunged for the rifle that had fallen near the fireplace, rolling just as Holloway swiped at him again. His fingers closed around the weapon, and in one swift motion, he turned and fired. The shot rang through the cabin, deafening. Holloway's accomplice hit the floor, groaning in pain as the bullet struck his leg. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. That left Holloway. Jack turned the rifle toward him, his breathing heavy. "It's over." Holloway stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he smirked. "You don't have the guts." Jack's finger hovered over the trigger. He wanted to end it. He wanted to make sure Holloway never came back. But then he heard its sirens in the distance. Sheriff Miller. Holloway cursed under his breath, realizing his time was up. He glanced at Grace one last time before darting toward the broken window, disappearing into the night. Jack didn't lower his rifle until the flashing lights filled the cabin with their eerie glow. This battle was over. But the war, that was another story. Part 8. The Final Stand. Jack stood in the doorway of his battered cabin, his pulse still racing from the confrontation. The sirens outside signaled that Sheriff Miller and her deputies had arrived, but Holloway was already gone. The man had slipped into the woods like a ghost, leaving behind chaos, destruction, and an unfinished war. Grace remained at Jack's side, her body tense, her ears perked toward the broken window where Holloway had disappeared. The pups, thankfully, were still safe, nestled in the corner near the fireplace, unaware of the storm raging outside and the danger that loomed over them. Miller stepped into the cabin, her expression grim as she took in the wreckage. "Damn, Jack," she muttered, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. "I knew he'd come back for her, but I didn't expect him to bring backup." Ack wiped the sweat from his brow, exhaling slowly. "Neither did I." One of the deputies, Collins, knelt next to the injured man on the floor, the one who had taken Jack's bullet to the leg. He was groaning, clutching at his wound, but he wasn't going anywhere. Miller turned to Jack. "I need you to tell me everything." From the start, Jack relayed the events of the night, the tripwire going off, the shattering window, the attack. He left nothing out. When he finished, Miller sighed and shook her head. "Holloway's not going to stop. He's too deep into whatever sick business he was running before." He's not just after Grace, he's trying to prove something. Jack already knew that. He had seen the look in Holloway's eyes. This wasn't just about a dog. This was personal. Preparing for the final battle, Miller left 2 deputies to patrol the woods, surrounding Jack's cabin while she and the others transported the injured man back to town. "We'll interrogate him, see if we can get him to talk," she said, before heading out. "But, Jack, be ready. If Holloway wants a war, he'll bring one." Jack spent the next few hours strengthening his defenses. He boarded up the broken window, reinforced the doors, and set up more tripwires. He wasn't going to be caught off guard again. This time, he would be ready. Grace never left his side. She moved with a silent, focused energy, her instincts razor-sharp. She knew this fight wasn't over. And neither did Jack. As night fell, Jack sat by the fireplace, rifle across his lap, listening to the sounds of the forest. The silence was thick, oppressive, the kind of quiet that came before a storm. Then, it came. A noise. A rustling in the trees. A crunch of snow under heavy boots. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. He stood slowly, his breath steady. "He's here." Grace let out a low growl, her body tensing, muscles coiling like a spring ready to snap. Then the first shot rang out. The battle for survival. The bullet slammed into the wooden door, splintering the wood inches from where Jack had been standing. He dropped low, moving swiftly to the side window, peering out. Holloway and 2 more men were advancing through the snow, their figures barely visible against the darkened tree line. Jack didn't hesitate. He fired back. The first shot clipped one of the men in the shoulder, sending him staggering backward with a pained shout. The second shot shattered a tree trunk inches from Holloway's head, forcing him to duck. Jack moved quickly, using the cabin's layout to his advantage. He had spent years in dangerous situations, and survival was second nature to him. He wasn't going to let Holloway win. Grace, as if sensing the stakes, darted through the cabin, staying low. When the door burst open, one of Holloway's men stormed inside, gun raised. Before he could fire, Grace lunged. Her teeth sank into his arm, the force of the impact sending him sprawling onto the floor with a pained scream. Jack took the opportunity, stepping forward and landing a solid kick to the man's ribs, knocking him out cold. Then came Holloway. The man moved like a predator, slipping into the cabin with practiced ease, his knife glinting in the dim light. "You've got fight in you, Carter," he said, voice calm, amused even. "But you're outnumbered, outgunned." Jack leveled his rifle. "Funny. Looks to me like you're the one who's running out of men." Holloway smirked, twirling the knife between his fingers. "This was never about numbers. You think you're protecting her. That dog is a weapon. You think she loves you. She was trained to obey, not to care." Jack's jaw tightened. "You're wrong. Am I?" Holloway took a step forward. "Let's see then. Call her. See who she listens to." Jack didn't have to. Grace didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, positioning herself between Jack and Holloway, her lips curling back in a dangerous snarl. Holloway's smirk faltered. Just for a second, that was all Jack needed. In a blur of motion, Jack swung the rifle like a club, catching Holloway in the side of the head. The man staggered, dazed, and before he could recover, Jack tackled him to the ground. The fight was brutal. Holloway fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. But Jack had something more. He had a reason to win. The struggle ended with Jack pinning Holloway's arm to the floor, his own knife pressed against the man's throat. "It's over," Jack growled. Holloway stared up at him, breathing hard, blood trickling from his temple. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a smirk. "You don't have it in you." Jack's grip tightened. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to end this. But he didn't, because he wasn't like Holloway. Instead, he shoved the man onto his stomach, restraining him just as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Sheriff Miller arrived moments later, her gun raised, her deputies swarming in. "Looks like you got him," she said. Jack exhaled, standing slowly. "Yeah, we got him." Grace sat beside him, her eyes never leaving Holloway as they dragged him away. It was finally over. Or was it? Part 9. Resolution and new beginnings. The aftermath of the battle left Jack's cabin in ruins. The air still smelled of gunpowder and blood, but the danger had passed. Sheriff Miller and her team had secured Holloway and his accomplices, dragging them back to town where they would finally face the justice they had long evaded. Jack stood outside his cabin, staring into the snowy woods. The same forest that had once provided him solace now held memories of violence and survival. The fresh layer of snow covering the ground did little to erase the footprints of the fight that had just taken place. Grace sat beside him, her head high, her ears alert. She had fought just as hard as he had, and in doing so, she had proved beyond any doubt that she wasn't just a survivor, she was a fighter. "It's finally over," Miller said as she approached, rubbing her hands together to ward off the cold. "We'll have Holloway locked up for good this time. He won't be coming back." Jack exhaled, but he felt no relief, at least, not yet. Men like him always find a way, but if he does, he won't get another chance. Miller nodded. "I believe you, but you should take some time to rest, Jack. You and that dog, both. You've been through hell." Jack looked down at Grace, who was watching him intently. He scratched behind her ear, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a small smile. "Yeah, we could use some rest, a fresh start." The following weeks passed in relative peace. Jack spent his time repairing the damage to his cabin, patching up the broken windows and reinforcing the doors. But some things couldn't be fixed so easily. The scars on his body would heal, but the ones left behind by the fight would take longer. Grace never left his side. If she had ever doubted her place in Jack's life, those doubts were gone now. She belonged here. So did her pups, who were growing stronger by the day. Jack had given them names Ember and Scout, the small one. Scout was adventurous, always exploring every corner of the cabin. Ember, slightly bigger, stuck close to her mother, learning everything she could from Grace. One afternoon, as Jack sat on his porch, sipping a cup of coffee, Grace came to sit beside him. She nudged his hand with her nose, demanding attention. Jack chuckled and ran a hand through her fur. "You did good, girl. You did real good." Grace let out a soft huff and rested her head against his leg. Jack gazed out at the forest, his mind drifting. He had spent so many years running from the world, thinking solitude was the only way to find peace. But now, with Grace and the pups beside him, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in years, he didn't want to be. Part 10. Reflection and lessons learned. The days stretched into weeks, and with each passing moment, Jack felt something he hadn't in a long time: contentment. The battle for survival had ended, and in its place was something he never expected: peace. Grace had fully recovered from the wounds of both body and spirit. She no longer jumped at every unfamiliar sound, no longer kept herself on high alert. She had accepted that she was home. Ember and Scout were thriving, their once frail bodies now strong and filled with boundless energy. They played in the snow, tumbled around the yard, and occasionally tested Grace's patience as they learned what it meant to be young and wild. Jack had spent much of his life rescuing others. As a firefighter, he had rushed into burning buildings, saving those who couldn't save themselves. He had always thought that purpose ended when he retired. But Grace and her pups had proven him wrong. One crisp morning, Jack walked down the path leading from his cabin, Grace at his side. The town was still adjusting to the news of Holloway's capture. People who had lived in fear of his operation were now free to breathe again. Jack had received visits from neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years, all thanking him for what he had done. He had never sought recognition, but their words had stuck with him. As he reached the town's small animal shelter, he stopped. Grace looked up at him, her head tilting slightly. Jack chuckled. "We've been through a lot, huh?" The shelter had reached out to him, asking if he'd be interested in helping with their rescue efforts. Many of the dogs that had suffered under Holloway's operation needed rehabilitation, patience, and a steady hand to show them they could trust humans again. Jack wasn't sure if he was ready. But as he looked down at Grace, who had once stood at death's door and had now become his greatest companion, he realized the answer. "Come on, girl," he said, stepping forward. "Let's see if we can help someone else get a second chance." The door to the shelter swung open, and for the first time in years, Jack felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The power of second chances. Life had a strange way of working things out. Jack had spent so long convinced that he was meant to be alone. But fate, or perhaps something greater, had brought Grace to his doorstep. She had needed him, but in truth, he had needed her just as much. Sometimes, the ones we save end up saving us. Jack had found something worth fighting for again, and as he stepped into the shelter, ready to help the next soul in need, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Final thoughts. Stories like Grace's remind us of the resilience of animals and the profound impact they can have on our lives. If this story touched your heart, let it inspire you to take action. Consider adopting, supporting a local shelter, or simply spreading awareness about the importance of rescuing animals. Because sometimes, the best companions come into our lives when we least expect them. If you believe in second chances, share this story. Together, we can make a difference one rescue at a time.